Okay, so that's the recording started. So I would like to introduce Richard Nevell to everyone. He is obviously known to us as our membership secretary, but tonight we will get to hear a bit more about his own research, and he is going to talk to us about rack and ruin, understanding why castles were demolished. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you very much, Gillian. So yes, the tables have turned, and I'll be talking about basically my favourite subject when it comes to castles, looking at how they ended up as they are today, and one very particular aspect of that. Now, while I was preparing for this talk, I came across something useful on Facebook, which is quite unusual, you might say. And it's something which took me back about 10 years to when I started on this journey. Someone asked a very good question. They're asking why so many castles in Britain are ruinous. Now, there are a whole host of answers, and we saw a range of those on Facebook coming through in the comments. Lots of people mentioned the English Civil War, and especially Oliver Cromwell. Some folks suggested that castles were obsolete after the invention of gunpowder. And some people also pointed out that castles were expensive to run, and many simply fell out of fashion. This reminded me of when I started the study of castle destruction. I went through a very similar process, wondering how they ended up in their current state. The answers on Facebook were also very familiar. And I think they're a good reflection of the general understanding of this very broad topic. And this is where our story begins. Castles come in all shapes and sizes. Some are being converted to modern use, some are in ruins, and others survive as lumps and bumps on the ground. I've tried to include a bit of variety in this talk, but I should probably point out at this stage that a lot of the sites I'll be discussing will be more at the ruined end of the scale. Centuries of decay can do that. Now, earlier this week, I included a couple of questions in the reminder emails I sent around to people. So let's see how this lines up with people's preferences. Well, I think that's largely good news. A fairly strong emphasis on ruins. Not enough people interested in lumps and bumps. That is a great shame. But most importantly, the ruins are what grab people's attention. I think that's a way in for many of us. I also asked if people could name some slighted castles. Bear in mind, this might not be a term that people are familiar with, but it is a term I will refer to several times and will explain. So if you've not come across it before, don't worry. This question was just to see how well informed people are, and I must say I'm really impressed. We've got some well-known sites. Kenilworth is there, Pontefract, Corfe and Raglan, fantastic ruins, very impressive sites. I think Kenilworth and Corfe are places people immediately think of when they think of castles. So yeah, it's good to see some personal favourites in there. And it looks to me like most of these relate to the English Civil War. Not at all surprising, that is when a lot of slighting took place. But whoever puts De Ganwy in there and Dryslewin gets some serious brownie points, because that's more the medieval end of the timeline. But overall, this shows just how big an impact the English Civil War has on our understanding of slighting and destruction. So, we know a lot about the construction of castles. Who, when, where, why, and how, all really important things. Now, of course, there are many sites for which we don't have this information, but we've got enough to tell grand stories, the narratives about how these sites developed, their role in medieval society, changes in power and architectural taste, and what it says about medieval society. what it says about the people who lived and worked at these sites. But we know a lot less about the end of their use. We can make some generalizations. They were allowed to decay, but some of the shells we see today were deliberately ruined. In many cases, these narratives and patterns and the circumstances of the end of the castle's use can be very obscure. So let's take a closer look at castles which were deliberately ruined. Now, when I started looking into destruction of castles, I came across this term, slighting. It's a word which crops up every so often in books about castles. It's not always well defined, and it's rarely found in the glossary. So it took a while to work out get to the heart of what it meant. In modern usage, it actually means to insult someone. But with castles, it refers to the act of deliberately damaging an important building or its contents to reduce its value. Now, the earliest use of this meaning is in the 17th century. So while it's a useful term, and it's tempting to place significance on the insult meaning, it's not a word that was used in the Middle Ages, and that's worth keeping in mind. This definition is important because it separates slighting from damage caused by sieges. In a siege, the purpose of causing damage is to take control of the castle. What happens next is really another event. With slighting, the intention is to degrade the castle's value. Now, whether that value is as a fortification or a status symbol or a home is very broadly construed. The tricky bit is telling the difference between those two types of damage, siege warfare and slighting. Now, this type of destruction can be seen in some really interesting episodes of history. Dynastic disputes in the 12th century, wars between England and France, the Anglo-Scottish Wars of the 14th century, and of course the English Civil War. Only a minority of castles were ever slighted. It's really hard to be sure how many, because no form of source material is comprehensive. There are undoubtedly sites which were slighted, but which haven't been investigated archaeologically, and for which no record of the event survive. And it's entirely possible that if they were invested archaeologically, that the evidence might not still survive, or might be restricted to just part of the site and therefore missed. Now, until relatively recently, slighting hasn't been well understood. 10 or 15 years ago, if you found slighting mentioned, there was a very good chance it was explained as being a way to prevent an enemy from using a castle or fortification against you. And probably that it was all Oliver Cromwell's fault. It wasn't until the 2000s that slighting was looked at systematically for the first time. Lila Rakowski led the way, challenging a number of long-held ideas along the way, and showing that slighting was a much more complicated affair with motives which differed in different contexts and different people involved as well. In fact, it usually wasn't Oliver Cromwell. Parliament gave a lot of orders, but equally the royalists did too. They are much less well documented. Parliament still has the lion's share, I think. Now, it made a lot of sense for this reinterpretation to begin with the 17th century. That's the last time many major castles were in use, and ruins of sites like Corfe and Kenilworth just grabbed the imagination so well. And it also helps that the historical records are much more detailed than those surviving from the Middle Ages relating to destruction of castles. Now, understanding slighting in the Middle Ages is slightly different as a result. The documentation is poorer, and the sites themselves are often in a more advanced state of decay. But the types of evidence we're dealing with are still fairly similar. Now, not every ruin is a result of slighting. It's worth keeping in mind that maintaining a castle was essentially a constant job. What we have here is what 240 years of decay and weather can do to even a very well-built stone building. It doesn't take long for vegetation to take root, and that needs dramatic intervention. Ivory-covered walls may look romantic, but the roots and vines get into cracks and slowly prise apart the stones. And then, of course, you have to contend with the weather. If a roof structure is compromised, the timber can decay and eventually rot. And this problem can be seen in records relating to many sites, for example, Pevensey, as we have on screen. Its inner ward was rebuilt in the mid-13th century with a new suite of domestic buildings. Just 30 years later, the royal documents show that these buildings were badly in need of repair. This was a royal site where funds were theoretically available for repairs. Less well-off owners might find that they couldn't afford the upkeep of their castles, and that is certainly a contributing factor. Between 1538 and 1543, John Leland travelled across England, and he was an early antiquarian. He wrote about historic buildings that he encountered on his travels. Again and again, he spoke of castles ruined through neglect. Time and the elements account for most ruins, but a significant number were slighted. To understand destruction, we need to combine historical and archaeological sources wherever possible. It allows us to tell a much richer story. Each type of evidence has its own benefits and limitations. The historical record is useful for telling us who was involved and when, giving absolutely valuable context. Very often we're relying on royal records, which may tell us how much was spent on slighting, but not how extensive it was or whether the orders were actually followed through. Archaeology is useful for exploring the impact of this event. It helps us understand what methods were used, how it was carried out, and from that, we can deduce something about the intentions of those involved. Excavations can provide evidence of rubble or burning, which might indicate destruction. Standing buildings can preserve evidence of rebuilding after partial deconstruction. Geophysical survey can also identify areas of burning. But when records show a castle was slighted, how confident can we be that these orders were followed? It's not always easy to tell. At Pevensey, for example, King John gave orders to demolish the castle while he retreated in the face of a French invasion force. There's no record of whether his orders were followed, so we're left to work out what happened next. This is kind of hindered by the castle's complex building history. There was a really major phase of building about 40 years after these events. And to be frank, the standing remains of the castle don't actually indicate that it was slighted. We're working with a fragmentary record, whether that's historical or archaeological. So we have here a picture of Caerlaverock in Scotland, a fantastic 13th century castle which was supposedly demolished in 1312, 1357 and 1570. But the original fabric is still clearly identifiable. So this demolition wasn't complete. We're not talking about a building which was completely leveled to the ground. This helps show that chronicles weren't always big on the detail of what happened. For example, Thomas Gray, who was writing a few decades after the events he was recounting, said that Robert Bruce had demolished all the castles in Scotland except Dumbarton. Thomas had been to Scotland and in fact had served as a soldier, so he would have seen for himself that plenty of castles were still standing, and they would have obviously predated Bruce. Thomas's point wasn't meant to be understood literally, but to simply convey that Bruce had demolished an awful lot of castles. So we need archaeology to understand the impact of slighting, to test these cases where we have some indication that a site was demolished. It helps us look beyond the exaggeration and vagueness of the contemporary sources. It also helps to identify castles which were slighted, but which haven't been covered in contemporary documentation at all. Now, this means that we need to know a bit about the tools people used to demolish castles. What was involved in slighting? So what we have here are elements of burning, picking, digging, and mining. Essentially, you could burn a castle. Even if it was primarily built in stone, there would have been timber elements. So you could go about burning that. So collapsing the roof structures, for example. If it was a timber castle, you could also burn that as well. This wouldn't necessarily have been particularly easy. If you've got well-seasoned timbers, they are more resistant to burning. And then there's picking. So this is when structures are prized apart. So literally using pickaxes and other tools to dismantle a building from the top down. With digging, this is used to refer to filling in ditches or moats and digging away earthworks, levelling banks and moats as well. So that is really time consuming. With picking apart a structure, you at least have the opportunity to reuse some of the materials. If you're filling in a ditch, there isn't an awful lot to be gained for that, perhaps unless you're planning on turning the area into agricultural land, which actually doesn't happen very often. And then we have mining, which is really interesting because that is quite hard to identify archaeologically. You have to get really lucky with that because the point of a mine shaft is that it's meant to collapse. This picture here in the bottom right is a preserved mine shaft underneath Bungay Castle in Suffolk. And it dates from the 12th century. So there are a few examples of mining. And this is interesting as well because that was another method which wouldn't have allowed much reuse of material, but would have been used primarily against stone buildings. Now, the reason this one was preserved is because the owner was perhaps able to pay off the king so the job was never finished. That didn't prevent other castles that he owned being demolished though. And then there's gunpowder. This, unsurprisingly, primarily relates to the English Civil War. There are some magnificent ruins from this period. And if you read some of the writings about them, it might seem that they were all blown up. Gunpowder changed warfare. Powerful cannons were able to batter down castle walls. Previously, if you had dug a mine underneath a castle and you collapsed it, this would be done by burning wooden props. But now you had the option of filling that mine with gunpowder to give it an extra boost. And that would collapse the walls with a very impressive bang. Now, perhaps once you captured a castle, you might want to slight it by detonating explosives. Now, this certainly could be done, but it's worth keeping in mind that gunpowder was expensive So a lot of what might be called blown-up castles are in fact sites which were demolished using other methods, ones which would have been very familiar to people in the Middle Ages. And I should point out that this is a point I'm borrowing from someone else's research, Lyda Rakowski again. I'm certainly not an expert in gunpowder, which is a shame as the experimental archaeology would be quite fun. In fact, while some castles did have gunpowder used in their destruction, this was definitely not the majority. Sometimes these varying methods of destruction would overlap. And this gives you a better indication that the slighting was deliberate, the destruction was deliberate, rather. Walls could collapse from bad workmanship, like, for example, the gatehouse of Conisbrough Castle. Or you could have fire spreading from a kitchen across a whole site, which happened at Bruff Castle in Northern England. But if you've got more than one of these methods evident at a site, usually, for example, filling in earthworks and picking away buildings, the odds are that indicates the castle was slighted. It's also important to take into account the scale of the damage incurred. An attack on a castle would only need to collapse a wall or create a breach to gain entry. When there is evidence of destruction across multiple areas, or even an entire site, it suggests that more effort than was needed to capture the fortification was used. So that really speaks to the deliberate nature of what was going on. So, who slighted castles? We very much rely on the documentary sources to work out who was involved. And in the Middle Ages, it was usually the king who gave the order to demolish a castle. As the most powerful person in the country, the king obviously had a few different options open to him. If someone had annoyed him, he could confiscate a castle and take it as his own to give to someone else. Destruction certainly wasn't his only option by any means. For the English Civil War, surviving records suggest that most of the destruction was carried out on Parliament's orders. But local people were also involved in decisions and actually carried out the work. Undoubtedly, royalists also demolished castles, but it's not nearly as well documented by contemporaries. Cases where owners dismantled their castles are less well documented. This could be in part because it didn't involve a mandate from another authority. And so that can be kind of an undocumented event. And so these are the kind of issues weighed up when someone was deciding whether to destroy a site or to confiscate it. So I'm going to talk about a very interesting period of English history. Damaging someone's property is a very personal act, which explains why it's linked to conflict and challenges to authority. Slighting a castle isn't just about preventing someone else from fighting against you. It's a direct attack on their status and prestige. So when the historical and archaeological records overlap, we can work out whose property was being slighted and why, and we get a really interesting story. So, the Anarchy features no less than 3 Henrys, so I'll try to keep things straight here. We have 2 kings and a bishop. The Anarchy was a civil war fought between 2 claimants to the throne, Stephen and Matilda. When King Henry I died in 1135, his only legitimate child was Matilda. Anticipating this might cause a problem, a few years earlier, he had made the leading nobles and churchmen in England swear an oath recognising Matilda as his heir. Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, had other ideas. He was popular in Anglo-Norman society, and when he heard news of Henry's death, he pressed his own claim to the throne. With help from his brother to win over the church, Stephen was crowned king. Stephen's brother was our other Henry. He was the Bishop of Winchester, Abbot of Glastonbury, and a very wealthy and influential man. He used his vast wealth to rebuild Glastonbury Abbey, found Winchester Palace in London, and the Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester, and buy relics and antiquities for Winchester Cathedral. He wasn't a particularly popular person, however. Henry of Huntingdon remarks that Bishop Henry was a new kind of monster, composed part pure and part corrupt. I mean, part monk and part knight. As well as being a man with a lot of power in the church, Henry also built castles. It wasn't just the castle building that earned him this reputation. Since other bishops had their own fortifications, this was hardly unprecedented. It was the fact that he took an active role in the Civil War that caused this umbrage. When Stephen went to war against Matilda's supporters, Henry was present at the siege of Exeter Castle, and once he was captured, he was put in charge. He also paid to raise soldiers, contributing to his brother's cause. Matilda wasn't going to let Stephen take the crown without a fight, and civil war followed the power grab. Some of the barons who had sworn to Henry I to recognise Matilda as ruler were uncomfortable with breaking their oath, and so supported her. Medieval warfare, especially in the 12th century, was characterised by sieges, and there were far more of them than pitched battles. You can ask Harold Godwinson how risky battles were. So, to get ready for war, the barons built castles, and plenty of them. And they were even less popular than Henry. The castle became resented as a symbol of this conflict. The war lasted for years, with periods of ascendancy for either side and long stretches of stalemate. At one point, Stephen was captured, so Henry began to make peace with Matilda. Then Matilda's leading general, Robert of Gloucester, was also captured. Matilda narrowly escaped being captured in Oxford Castle by climbing out of a window and fleeing across a frozen river. There was a prisoner exchange, and Stephen was eventually released. Eventually, neither side particularly wanted to fight further pitched battles, and so agreed to a treaty. Under the terms of the Treaty of Winchester, Stephen would remain king, and on his death, he would be succeeded by Matilda's son. Stephen's own son, Eustace, was furious at being cut out of the inheritance, but died soon after, which made things a good deal easier for the transition of power. Now, though it didn't make the final draft of the treaty, the Gesta Stephani records that both sides agreed to dismantle castles built during this war. The country would be returned to the state it had been before the conflict broke out. The treaty was signed in the summer of 1153, and Stephen was dead by October the next year. In the meantime, Matilda's son, Henry, still managed to complain about how slow the progress of dismantling castles had been. And when he was crowned king, that was about to change. Bishop Henry was present at Henry II's coronation in his role as Bishop of Winchester. But in 1155, he left England and went to Cluny Abbey. It just so happens that this was part of France, putting him well beyond Henry II's reach. Having complained to Stephen that castles weren't being destroyed quickly enough, it's not surprising that Henry II started to sort this out. With the bishop out of the country, the king decided to demolish his castles. The pipe rolls, royal documents of the time, don't tell us which sites these were, but a chronicler, Robert of Torigny, says that it was all of the bishop's castles. So what did these sites look like before this happened? Wolvesey and Bishop Waltham were palatial, and while they had curtain walls typical of castles, they were created as grand residences. Farnham had some stone buildings, while others seem to have been a bit more ephemeral in their structures. All of these were new foundations, and most of them were mentioned in the Winchester Annals as being built in 1153. Fortunately, some of these sites have been excavated, so we can start to piece together what happened. Test whether this was rhetoric in the chronicles or if these buildings really were demolished. At Desborough, one of these sites, only earthworks remain of the castle. Excavations in 1987 discovered that the ditch had been partly filled in. So again, that speaks to a lot of effort involved in this. The excavations weren't particularly extensive, so we're unsure what happened actually inside the castle. But we can show that the defences were deliberately damaged. The ditch was partly filled with material from the rampart, and any palisade that would have been on top was dismantled, and it's likely that the timbers were taken away to be reused. The castle you see today at Farnham has some 12th century elements and some buildings from the 15th century. The focus of the complex is the motte, with its circular curtain wall on top. Until the 20th century, it looked like Henry hadn't done a very good job of slighting the castle, as the 12th century walls are pretty intact. Perhaps these royal records and chronicles recorded posturing rather than events that had been followed through. That interpretation changed in 1958, when excavations on top of the motte unexpectedly found the remains of a square keep. They noticed that stones from the keep had been used to build the walls which still stand on top of the motte. So there's a clear relation that it postdates the destruction of the square keep. The destruction of the keep is important. You might have heard the trope that these buildings were a last line of defense when it comes to castles, where the garrison went when all else was lost. As with a lot of castle architecture, it wasn't quite this simple. You could indeed use them that way, as the defenders of Rochester Castle showed in their legendary but ultimately unsuccessful defense against King John in 1216. But crucially, they were also symbols of power. Since we only have the ground floor plan of the keep, we don't know how it appeared at its full height. But similar towers did have ceremonial spaces within them and were built with display in mind. And the reconstruction on the left gives an idea of how Farnham might have looked like before it was slighted. Bishop Henry returned to England a couple of years later with the reassurance from the Archbishop of Canterbury that the king was happy for him to return. Sadly, we don't know when Farnham Castle was rebuilt. The archaeologists didn't recover firm dating evidence, and documents indicate it was standing by 1208, but that's a pretty wide margin. It would be interesting if the bishop was the one to conduct the rebuilding of the castle, as it would demonstrate a return to power. But sadly, that's a bit speculative. But it is plausible that he would have done it, since he rebuilt Bishop's Waltham. When he did so, he added a tower reminiscent of square keeps of the period, and with explicitly military architecture. Henry wasn't going to completely abandon building castles after the setback of the Civil War. This tells us something which I wasn't expecting. When I started studying the destruction of castles, I thought that destruction would be the end of the story. If you go to the trouble of demolishing a building for whatever reason, you're probably not going to want a very similar building built on top of it. Whatever you are trying to prevent someone from doing, whether it's using a fortification against you or eroding its other forms of value, something dramatic would have to change for it to be rebuilt, because that kind of undoes some of the message and the meaning. So perhaps the initial act of destruction was enough to accomplish Henry II's aim of being seen to restore the country and sending a message to the bishop that in England, his power would never be as great as it had once been. The two Henrys, the king and the bishop, did eventually reconcile. So the king probably didn't mind the bishop rebuilding some of his sites. So the anarchy might be the first time that castles in England were deliberately demolished, especially on a large scale. In fact, I think we can say that on a large scale, it was. And this particular act became an important part of medieval society. Its use varies from country to country. In England, it was mostly used in the 12th and early 13th century and was closely linked to royal authority, usually a monarch reasserting their power after a conflict. So as well as this destruction in the wake of the anarchy, Henry II also demolished castles in the 1170s when his sons rebelled against him. It's worth pointing out that he wasn't so interested in his sons' castles, but those of his supporters. The Earl of Leicester suffered worst out of any of the rebellion supporters and had perhaps 5 of his castles demolished by the king. The reason probably comes down to straightforward animosity between the king and the earl. At peace talks in 1173, the earl became frustrated and apparently moved to draw his sword on the king. He was held back, but the earl had already sealed his fate. Attacking the king was one of the highest crimes, and simply because he hadn't succeeded didn't mean he was going to get away with it. The king had promised that none of the rebels would be harmed, so he couldn't execute the earl without breaking his word. Instead, he looked for other ways to punish the earl. At the end of the war in 1174, the Treaty of Montlouis declared that the rebels would retain the lands they had before the war, and that any conquests either side had made would be returned. However, that didn't stipulate the condition the property would be in. So while Henry couldn't confiscate lands or castles under the terms of the treaty, he could knock down pretty much as many sites as he wanted. The Earl's castles were slighted, especially his main seat at Leicester. And you can see here in the diagram at the bottom, a ditch fill from around the motte. And this contains a fairly thick layer of rubble, indicating that the stone buildings, or at least some stone buildings, were demolished. There was a certain amount of pragmatism that went with slighting. The Earl of Suffolk, Hugh Bigod, supported the rebellion against Henry II, along with the Earl of Leicester. The demolition of his castle of Framlingham was overseen by the king's engineer, which was unusual and shows that it was both a complex task and an important one. His other important castle at Bungay, which we saw a picture of mine at earlier, was very nearly demolished. So it appears that Bigod was able to pay a large fine of 1,000 marks to spare the castle, though it wasn't enough to spare Framlingham. Though the latter was subsequently rebuilt, archaeologists still found a considerable depth of rubble from the first castle. Henry wasn't the only king to face rebellion, but to be able to demolish a castle as a form of punishment you need to balance whether it will have a negative reaction, and a strong one. In 1212, when King John heard rumours of a plot against him, he demolished castles belonging to the two barons who were implicated. When Henry II demolished castles after a conflict, he was reasserting his power, and that's what John did in 1212. However, towards the end of John's reign, when conflicts broke out, he was never in a position to reassert that kind of authority, even on occasions where he took control of castles from the rebels. John was pioneering in at least one way. He may have been the first king of England who demolished his own castles to prevent someone else from using them against him. And this goes back to an old trope about slighting being primarily to prevent someone from using fortifications against you. John at least seems to have fit within that particular pattern. The barons who rebelled against John invited the French prince to invade and help him win their war. In return, he would be crowned King of England. So, in the face of an invasion, John gave orders to dismantle the castles at Chichester, Pevensey, Hastings, and Porchester. He was ignored at Porchester and Chichester, which instead ended up being surrendered to the prince. At Pevensey, as I mentioned before, it wasn't entirely clear whether anyone paid attention to John. And since much of the inner ward was rebuilt in the 13th century, it's really hard to tell. The keep and the gatehouse, which date from the 12th century, don't show signs of having been repaired after suffering damage. I mean, that's tricky with a keep, given the state it's currently in. But with the gatehouse, that's a very good sign, because it would have been an important part of the castle, both in terms of being a useful defence and an important point of display. Perhaps no one listened to poor old John. A similar tactic was used by Robert Bruce during the Scottish Wars of Independence. He knew that castles helped the English control Scotland and suited the English style of warfare. So to push them out, the castles needed to go. Siege warfare was very much preference of the English, and Bruce had previously been burned in, or rather, had a siege go against him. So he was wary of engaging in siege warfare too much. He instead chose to demolish the great royal fortresses at Edinburgh, Stirling, and Roxburgh. Not quite all the castles in Scotland, but a few important ones. Though they had been in English hands, these castles were bound up with Scottish history and had a lot of meaning to their people. So the decision to destroy them wasn't taken lightly. In fact, on hearing news of the destruction of the castles, the English king of the time wept. I mentioned earlier that when historical and archaeological sources overlap, we can tell a really interesting story. In 1224, Fawkes de Briote imprisoned a royal judge. His relationship with the king had been worsening for a while, and this was the last straw. The young king, Henry III, began an 8-week siege of Bedford Castle, Fawkes's main property. This was not a large-scale rebellion, so Henry was able to concentrate on the siege. He must have thought he was using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. The persistence of the defenders infuriated him, and worse, Fawkes got away. On capturing the castle, Henry had the garrison executed, and that's what we can see here in the chronicle. He also ordered the destruction of the castle. This is especially interesting as the previous owner had been lobbying to be given the castle back for a while and was waiting in the wings, hoping to retrieve it now Fawkes had fallen from grace. Unfortunately for him, he was out of luck, and instead Henry chose the route of destruction. Excavations between 1969 and 1972 showed just how extensive the destruction was. The archaeologists found large amounts of rubble and could tell that the motte had been truncated. Rather than a smooth profile, it had been cut away. So again, this was an extremely time-consuming task. This was more than just a token effort. This was making sure that pretty much anything of value on the site was being leveled. And the motivation seems to be to fully convey Henry's fury. So castles were an important part of people's identity and provoked emotional responses. During the anarchy, Gundred de Warenne surrendered Warwick Castle when she was told that her husband, the Earl of Warwick, had died. This was a trick, and when the Earl heard the news, he apparently died in a fit of shame and poetic irony. The archaeology shows us that destruction, as mentioned in royal records and chronicles, wasn't always complete or even permanent. Very often, the outer walls of a castle were demolished and the ditches filled in. But in some parts, other aspects were left alone. When a castle had a freestanding chapel, for instance, rather than being a building in a larger room, it was very rare for it to be included in the destruction. It represented a different kind of authority, and perhaps that's why it was spared. Maybe the people involved in the demolition would have been reluctant to touch a religious structure. Interestingly, great halls were often excluded from the destruction. Castles were centres of administration. Courts were held there and taxes collected. Great halls were part of that administrative architecture and infrastructure. So leaving one intact allowed for some continuation of governance, some continuation of use of the site even. On very rare occasions, where buildings with functions for the surrounding area were damaged, these were repaired or replaced. For example, with the destruction of Bedford, this included the county jail, but that was very quickly replaced. So destroying a castle was not the only option when it came to disposing of a castle. And it's much more common to confiscate and redistribute them. This, of course, had the effort of rewarding someone else. So the choice to demolish one is very telling. And we can see here in this map that they're distributed pretty much across the country. You might be able to see that there are clusters in Wales, especially in the 13th century. In England, it relates to the 12th century, and in Scotland, the 14th. These are very broad generalizations. There are sites which buck this trend or are outliers. Essentially, the factors often vary from place to place. So, throughout my research, I found that across England, Scotland, and Wales, there is archaeological evidence of around 60 castles being slighted. And there's more based on documentary evidence. The figures here are based on that archaeological information, which is a more conservative approach since the documentary records haven't yet been tested on the ground to see whether they are followed through. So it's important to bear in mind that destruction was carried out for a variety of reasons. It usually involved an aspect of asserting power and dominance over others. And it was especially common in the 12th and 13th centuries, which is why I've talked about the anarchy and related conflicts. Where we know who's responsible, it was usually royal authority. And after a castle was slighted, it was just as likely for it to be repaired and reused as it was for it to be completely abandoned. It's also worth pointing out that these charts don't take into account the English Civil War and the 17th century, where something like more than 100 sites were slighted. And that would be a whole other kettle of fish. When it comes to dismantling your own building, the motivations are very individual. If one owner doesn't see the value of the past, that's when buildings are lost to the future. And sometimes there was that interest in preventing other people from using a site. There remains a lot to understand about destruction, and it'd be interesting to examine it in other situations, other building types, other periods. Castle Studies has a lot to offer here. Personally, though, I hope to be able to go out and do some field work this year and start exploring ruins again. So, on one final note, if you do want further reading, here are a list of sources, some of which are open access. Don't worry about scribbling those down. I would actually recommend that you look up the Wikipedia article on slighting, because I've been using that to share some information, and pretty much all of these are listed there. And the list is less self-serving. It's not just me in that list. So thank you, everyone. That is an introduction to castle slighting.
Thank you very much, Richard. So a round of applause for Richard, please. And I will just stop the recording before we turn to questions, of which we already have a couple in the chat. So let me just stop this.